My name is Michaela Parker. I'm the founder and executive director of the Academic Data Science Alliance, and I'm here to welcome you to our Oceanography Career Panel. This is part of a career panel series that we offer where we demystify the data work behind a number of jobs and sectors. But before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our organization in case you're unfamiliar. So the Academic Data Science Alliance, or ADSA, is a community of data science researchers and educators who take responsibility for a just, equitable future where data science approaches are thoughtfully applied in all domains for the benefit of all. On the bottom of this slide is a QR code. If you snap that with your mobile phone, it will take you to our website where you can learn more about ADSA activities, events, and how to become a member. So with that, let's get started. This career panel series is brought to you by the ADSA Career Development Network, which is a community for early and mid-career data scientists. Again, if you want to learn more about that community and possibly join, the information is on our website, or you can reach out to Stella Min. Her address, her email address, and my email address are on this slide. Okay, so now let's get started with today's panel. I am very excited to talk about oceanography today with our panelists. Winnie Lau is the project director for the Pew Charitable Trust program to reduce global ocean plastic pollution. She spearheaded Pew's comprehensive report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, which laid out pathways to stop the problem, and now it works to advance strategies to tackle the issue throughout the global value chain. In addition, she has led Pew's efforts on the 30 by 30 initiative and expanded Pew's engagement in Asia. Before joining Pew, she was the Climate Change Science and Technology Advisor with the U.S. Agency for International Development's mission to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. She also managed the Marine Ecosystem Services Program at Forest Trends and was a Science and Technology Policy Fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, at the U.S. State Department. Lau holds a bachelor's degree in integrative biology and environmental sciences from the University of California, Berkeley, and a doctorate in oceanography from the University of Washington, which is where I know her from. Adrienne Oakley received her PhD in marine geology and geophysics from the University of Hawaii, Manoa in 2008. She is an associate professor of geology and marine science in her 14th year at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. Along the Delmarva coast, which I learned is part of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, Dr. Oakley studies the effects of sea level rise and environmental change on barrier islands and salt marshes in collaboration with NASA, US FWS, the Chincoteague Bay Field Station, or CBFS, the state of Virginia, and Kutztown and Shippensburg University faculty and students. Dr. Oakley served as the chair of the Academic Advisory Council for the CBFS in Wallops Island, Virginia for 5 years, and is the coordinator of KU's Marine Science Program. Dr. Oakley is a 2019 AGU Voices for Science advocate in the Media Public Communications track. She's passionate about science communication and believes that conveying the value of science to non-scientists is critically important. And finally, we welcome Dr. Kenia Whitehead. She is a senior aquatic scientist with more than 15 years of experience specializing in quantitative analysis of complex environmental data sets with specific expertise in aquatic biogeochemistry and environmental analysis. As a leader in GSI's aquatic science practices, she focuses on methods that provide integrated assessments and an understanding of underlying processes to support strategic approaches to remedial investigations, impact assessments, environmental forensics, and allocation support for contaminated sediment sites. So to kick us off, I was wondering if each of you could tell us a little bit more about your journey to your current position and just a brief overview of what you do now. And let's start with Winnie.
Thanks, Michaela. Hi, everyone. As Michaela said, I'm Winnie Lau. I am currently the project director for the Preventing Ocean Plastics project at the Pew Charitable Trust. And as Michaela also mentioned in my introduction, I knew her from the University of Washington Oceanography program, where we both got our PhDs. from the same advisor as well. So after I got my PhD from the University of Washington, I wanted to take my knowledge and experience and be a bridge between science and policy. Because I thought that, we do a lot of great science in universities, but it's not often acted upon. And so I wanted to be more direct, have a more direct involvement in making sure that our science gets used. And so I applied for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and then went to work at the State Department. There, I didn't really use a lot of data, but I really drew upon my training in oceanography. And I worked in an office where they were examining ocean iron fertilization and whether that should be a policy the U.S. government supported, as well as looking at invasive species. And after that experience at the State Department, I went and worked at a small nonprofit and taking some of the science, some more of the science, but taking it from a perspective of working on conservation projects in communities. And then that led to a position with the U.S. Agency for International Development to develop their climate change program in the Maldives. And there, I worked with a lot of with consultants and other scientists to really help the Maldives think about how climate change and sea level rise would affect their livelihoods. And so that was a really interesting experience, being kind of in the front lines of climate change, where people and communities that are really going to be affected have to deal with make choices about what they do. So then after that, I wanted to come back to the US. And so I now work at the Pew Charitable Trust in Washington, D.C., and have been working on the ocean plastic pollution problem for the last 5+ years. And I know we're going to dive a little bit more into that. And so I'll stop there for now. Looking forward to speaking with all of you today.
Great, thank you, Winnie. Let's just continue in the alphabetical order how I introduced you for this question. So Adrienne, could you go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. My name is Adrienne Oakley. I have a different path. I think in my path to oceanography was a little bit different in the sense that I am a geologist by trade, but I do most of my geology in or next to the ocean. So I would call myself a marine geologist, sort of peripheral to the oceanography side of things. But my journey started as an undergraduate in Maine. I was doing coastal marine geology there. And then I went to the University of Hawaii for my PhD, where I was doing marine geology and geophysics in the deepest part of the ocean. So we were studying plate tectonics and mapping in the Mariana Trench and those areas that were some really very, very data rich, lots and lots of geophysical data and bathymetry, and working with massive data sets in very remote locations and a lot of time at sea, and working with a lot of oceanographers as well from the University of Hawaii. And I was able to go on many cruises of various different types, not just marine geophysical cruises. So I got to sort of see all of the different oceanography. I should mention, I actually fell in love with doing work in the ocean at 18 after my freshman year of college, my first research cruise. So I had to go. I was so fortunate to be able to do that. And all throughout my PhD, that was kind of in the back of my mind that I wanted to end up working at an undergraduate institution where I could try to provide some of those opportunities to undergraduate students. So I was working at the university at a very large PhD granting R1, but I wanted to go back to a primarily undergraduate institution. So that was where I was headed, even though I was doing this big grant funded huge projects in very remote locations. So when I finished my PhD, I ended up very fortunately, very quickly actually, getting a tenure track position at Kutztown University, where I am now. I am currently an associate professor of geology and marine science, and this is where I sort of started, because now I teach oceanography and physical oceanography and all of these courses that I didn't really take as a graduate student, but now get to teach and work with. But also working in the Western Pacific on research, on huge research cruises, was not that accessible. So I had to do a complete 180 in my research and ended up now working on coastal Virginia. So now I went from the deepest to the shallowest. So my current work is focused on things that are a bit more accessible to students and also societally relevant. We work on coastal erosion and sea level rise, salt marshes, and changing habitats. So I work now with I've had to become a little bit more of a biologist as well. I've had to, working with Fish and Wildlife Services and NASA. Veronica, whose name is on there, I worked with when she was working on in her program as well. So I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of undergraduate students and a few master's students, and really try to provide as many opportunities for students as I can from rural Pennsylvania. And then I took 5 undergraduate students on a research cruise. We were out for 6 weeks, and that was in 2011. So that was an amazing opportunity to be able to bring some students out to sea. And we were able to do some really cool marine geophysics research as well. And then, as you mentioned, I have done the AGU Voices for Science program to try to increase my skills in science communication. And these are the skills that I'm trying to share with my students so that as they leave their undergraduate, they are effective science communicators, not only to other scientists, but more importantly, to the general public and to the policymakers. As Winnie mentioned, there's a big disconnect there. So learning how to do that, something I'm still striving toward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Kenia?
Hi, thanks for having me. So I guess my start actually in marine science happened almost by accident, but I was in high school. I got a Howard Hughes internship and happened to have a neighbor who was a geologist. I was in San Diego at Scripps Institute of Oceanography that connected me to a lab that did ocean optics and phytoplankton ecology. And I loved growing things in bottles already. So I started there, and then the lab just kept me on. I went to UCSD for my undergrad. I majored in biochemistry and molecular biology, and then hung around. They have an integrated BS-MS program. So then I was able to do my master's at UCSD with all the research at Scripps. And then it was time to go to grad school. I really wanted to do that. I wanted to continue the research and the field work. And so I went to University of Washington. So I got to meet and overlap with both Winnie and Michaela. And it was an amazing experience. And I went into an organic geochemistry lab, even though I was a biologist, which is how I ended up as a biogeochemist. A lot of that is because and one of the things I love about oceanography is that belief that nothing happens in isolation, especially when we're talking about the biology and it's subject to the physics and the chemistry. So from there, I stayed, I did a postdoc through an NSF biocomplexity grant. Then I wrote and got my own postdoctoral fellowship from NSF, and I went to a place called Institute for Systems Biology. This was definitely a jog out of the marine world, but I really wanted to bring in a lot of the genomics and systems analysis. And that's one of the places where, while we had worked with a lot of disparate data types within oceanography, all of a sudden it got me to big data, because it was the genomics level stuff where you have millions and billions of data points. And I learned to love coding. From there, I stayed there for a while, and actually it was more like life. It was the balance of family and having kids, which kind of took me from thinking about a soft money position to a more applied science position. And I we'll get into this later, but it was completely by accident in a way that I ended up in consulting. And I joined a consulting firm right when the Deepwater Horizon incident happened. So my first project and working in the regulated community was literally working for BP to provide data and information and science processing and communication for the Deepwater Horizon's work. And then since there, I really learned that I love applying everything that I learned on the marine science side to how do we clean up aquatic environments. So most of my work is on is on contaminated sediment sites. The firm I work for is called GSI Environmental, and we are essentially the science providers to move sites forward for whoever in particular is our client, but really we're there to help communicate. And that gets to the communication piece, which is how do you bring these groups together? You have the industry, you have the regulators. I usually work on Superfund sites. So I'm dealing with both federal and state and multiple agencies, along with the responsible parties. And how do we move things forward in a manner that makes sense and moves the site forward towards cleanup to reduce risk to both the ecology and human health? And that's what I do now.
Thank you. I heard a theme or a thread through all of your trajectories around communication and how important that is to communicate to policymakers, to regulators, to the public, right? And do that in an effective way. And I think maybe we'll loop back to that if we have time. But selfishly, I wanted to also highlight for our audience how incredibly diverse and interdisciplinary oceanography can be in terms of the types of data that get used. Kenia just mentioned genomics, and oceanography has borrowed a lot of tools from biomedicine and those fields that have pioneered the work in the genomics and transcriptomic spaces. But there's, of course, satellite data and all kinds of other water collection and chemistry and analyses that can be done. Maybe you could all briefly just touch on what types of data did you work with, especially if they were sort of larger data sets as you were training for oceanography, and then also in your current positions. And maybe we'll do this in reverse order, since Kenia, you did just mention genomics. You could give us a little bit more information about that.
Sure. One of the things I enjoy, especially right now at this point in my career, is I tend to serve as the hub on big projects. So I have scientists from different types of scientists with different levels of different types of expertise, and I integrate that information to be like a cohesive conceptual site model of what's going on. In terms of the data types, a lot of geospatial data, which includes, some of the basics, just parcel lines, topography. We process a lot of historical imagery and use satellite data and satellite-derived products. But we also have a ton of analytical chemistry data. It doesn't matter, soil, sediment, surface water, groundwater, air, biota. It can be fish or whatever the organisms are that are relevant to the site. So we have tissue data as well. Toxicity testing with endpoints that can range from a microbial response or gene expression, all the way through endpoints that are just like growth and survival, kind of a more crude measurements, we call it. And we do historical data. So we need to know what company operated over which time, which chemicals went in and out, what were the processes. And so we layer on a lot of that kind of historical documentation, and it can go back 100 years of whatever records we can find that we bring into all of this science and environmental space.
That's great, thank you. Let's go, Adrienne. And then
Winnie. I'll put that on, build on that. Again, the historical data, that's absolutely something because I'm working in coastal zones right now, we do a lot of aerial photographs and old maps, spend a lot of time digitizing shorelines that we can put into ArcGIS and a program called DSAS. So trying to think about shoreline change, and so digitizing those going back to land use, how things are. So as many old maps, anything we can get our hands on to figure out when the roads were put in, how the land use had changed in the area from, when were they clearing farmland, when it became government property or managed by National Park Service. So working on those data sets. And then we also have, for our current research, we have been collecting just grain size analysis, physically going out, collecting sand samples and analyzing those and getting mean grain sizes, putting those together and trying to find ways to visualize how sand moves on a beach. So you can have one data point, but it's not very useful unless you can see that, the take-home point, sand moves, don't build on it. And with sea level rise. So looking at and going back with, again, satellite data, sea level rise in, so high mean sea levels back over time, wave data, trying to find the best wave data. Very few places we've actually put in our own sensors because the area we were working, the sensors were too far offshore. Things were changing on these little micro scales. So trying to put some of our own sensors for groundwater and wave data and then mining all of the NOAA data for wind and waves and tides, that kind of data set. So anything related to the coastal environment. And then previously to that, most of what I was working on, again, as I was doing big plate tectonics, I was looking at huge mapping data sets. So we were looking at bathymetry at all different scales, trying to get rid of the data artifacts and get those in to make comprehensive maps. And some of that was gravity data as well. So we were looking at gravity, magnetics, and seafloor bathymetry.
Great, thank you. And Winnie?
So my data journey, I think it's been quite diverse, I would say. So I actually started doing research, I might even say in high school, because I connected with a professor at Cal State LA who was doing ecology research on Catalina Island, and we were making blocks to measure wave action. This is, I think, before the sophisticated sensors were developed, and so we were using very traditional methods where we put blocks on different parts of the islands and then brought them back into the lab and measured how much was eroded. Then I worked in a hydrodynamics lab where I was trying to measure the hydrodynamic forces on crabs. I think I tortured enough crabs in my lifetime, and then also measuring water flow in different estuaries and bays. So from there, in grad school, I actually switched to doing a lot of genomics work. I was trying to understand how different chemical and biological environments affected the composition of bacterial community diversity. So I did a lot of sequencing. And the funny thing was, when I was in undergrad, I was like, no way, I'm never doing molecular biology. And then I ended up doing that. But then trying to connect that to some of the chemistry data. It was touch and go, but did some of that. Then now I switched to a place where I don't collect primary data myself. The team I work with, we use secondary data, basically what's been published out there, and then bringing it all together. And from multiple types of sources too, from scientific publications to very gray literature, because right now we're trying to look at the plastic value chain. So basically from, what's produced all the way to what happens to the plastic. And there's no one source, no one place where you can get data across the whole life cycle of plastics. And so we had to cobble together from many different sources, make a lot of assumptions about how these numbers fit into the model that we built. But what I learned from oceanography, but also from a class in undergrad called Consider a Spherical Cow, is how to take the data and be able to put it together to get enough information out of the data and the modeling analysis to try and understand a system. And so that's where I am today. So it's kind of really run the gamut to the work of being in the field with more traditional methods, to all the way now using secondary data and putting it all together.
I love that. I love that you're tying these all together, and it sounds again like that is the theme, right? All of you have done work where you're collecting individual data types, but you're actually trying to synthesize all of that to understand a system, right? And to have a better insight at a holistic approach. So I'm going to take that one step even further and say, let's jump a little bit into the communications then. So now that you've collected all of this information and all this data, and you've had a way to synthesize it or to integrate it to better understand the system in your work now, how do you communicate that? And are there any skills that you picked up along the way through your career that helped you be better at communicating to your stakeholders, the public, the regulators? And I'll just open that up in case somebody wants to jump in first.
I can do that because I actually do a lot of that now. So I'll start off by saying at the Pew Charitable Trust, I have support from a whole communications team who train me and help prepare me, which has been invaluable. And, some of the lessons I've learned from doing the work I do now is that first and foremost, communicating science is really important. And especially getting it in front of the right people, because what I do right now is try to get the information in front of the decision makers so that they can actually hopefully try and craft policies that are grounded in science and are evidence-based, so that the efforts that are being put into the policy space will be effective. Because at the end of the day, we put in place policies to hopefully try to solve a problem, and you want to make sure that what is being put in place is actually the right thing to do. Now, policymakers have a lot of demands in terms of what they need to consider. Science is one of them, and people and business interests. I mean, they all factor into what policymakers hear and listen to. So it's really important that the science that I communicate, I consider the audience. I really think about the message I want to communicate, and then I have to use language that the policymakers will understand. So, get rid of all the jargon, like acronyms, because they don't know what they are, and nothing is as deflating as watching people just kind of look away or their eyes glaze over and stop paying attention. So you get good feedback that way. But so really think about your audience. And then the second thing is practice a lot. Because I will tell you, because I was trained as a scientist, in moments of being asked unexpected questions, I have noticed myself reverting to speaking the way I would as a scientist. And I'm like, oh God, I should not have said it that way. That's not the way to communicate with a policymaker. So it's like practice. It's almost like learning a new language and like really getting it into your brain.
That is great advice. Adrienne or Kenia, do you have something to pile on there?
Absolutely. And in some ways, I come at this from both being an educator and having to go through some of this training. So a lot of what I learned was because I am a college professor and I teach undergraduate courses for general education students. This may be their only science class they take ever. It's no pressure, I have to teach all the good science and how science is done. And I feel, in all of these things that are so important to try to create a more educated citizenship and, and voter base, and trying to sort of, in a lot of ways, demystify, make sure that scientists are humans and we are not, automatons, and so trying to learn how to communicate effectively. And I am from a region where there is a lot of, there's still a lot of mistrust of higher education and of scientists. And so trying to communicate to both my science majors and the gen ed students who are taking this, hopefully because they have an interest, but also because they have to check a box on their general education, liberal arts check sheet. So I've learned how, somewhat Winnie was saying, too much terminology or what's really important. Maybe they're not getting the stuff that I think is so cool and exciting, but it's still nitty gritty of trying to do the big picture and really get the stuff that is relevant to their lives. So communicating that and then trying to do a better job of that was when I started with the Voices for Science program, mainly because I'm pretty good at communicating, I feel, at different levels to the general public and different levels of college students, but I'm absolutely terrified to talk to politicians. It's a completely different style. So in the training that I got, I learned about writing your one-pagers, the scientist policy, one-page summary in maybe 8th grade or so, basic of how to make your asks, how to explain your research, and these are now things that I'm trying to teach my students to do. So I did get better. I'm slightly less terrified of working with politicians, but it is a completely different side of science communication. So I'm still working on it and still learning, but every time I'm able to add something new that I have learned, I'm then trying to pass it on to my students. So in all my classes, I do scientist spotlights, which I learned about at a workshop that is taking real people. I plug in from, you all might be tapped soon, but I take this from, people, a lot of graduate school trying to do bios and history and do a mini version of, where do these people come from and what kind of cool research are they doing, tie it to the curriculum. So my students are starting to see scientists as people coming from all these different diverse backgrounds. And it's easier to take what scientists say if you feel like they're human people, that are human people. They're actual people that came from the same background that these students did, these landlocked states, and they're in oceanography and they're doing marine bio and they're doing all these great things. So trying to find ways to get better myself, and then anything I learn passing on to the students that I teach.
Excellent. Thank you. Kenia, do you have any communications wisdom you want to pass along? Or
Not sure wisdom, but I think it's the same point of the know your audience. One of my big lessons was just the restraint on the technical end. Because if you spent hours and hours doing some nitty-gritty machine learning analysis and blah, 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 the person you're communicating it to, they may or may not care about that end of it. So we do a lot of the bluff, that bottom line up front. Communication, and it really depends. You scale your science to your audience. Obviously, if you have a technical team meeting, then go in. You got to put it all out there because it really is about the science. Even when we start meeting with regulators, then you scale that science to the regulators. So that takes some people knowledge, some getting to know them. I remember presenting on an issue for Mercury, and all my slides had HG on them. And towards the end of the hour, finally somebody goes, "Oh, that HG, that's Mercury. My bad. That's on me." And that was my big lesson. So, spell out my elements, define all our things, don't use the alphabet soup. And then, of course, I also end up working with a lot of lawyers practicing environmental law, whether helping them on different issues. And that is a completely different world of communication. It's fascinating. It is very bottom line. It is very answer the question as asked. Do you know what time it is? Yes. You don't offer to tell them what time it actually is. So it's a really different style of communication, as is communicating when you're doing it around legal matters with science, and how do you explain your science to a judge, right? So it's a really different process, but again, it's always back to who your audience is and take that into consideration, and then modulate yourself from there.
Oh, that's great advice. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Sure,
Michaela?
go for it. Jump in. This is conversation. Please do.
I want to reinforce what Kenia said. The communications people here at Pew always say, don't bury the lead, because I think as scientists, we want to explain before we get to the what. So what? Actually, you have to bring the so what first. And I recently reviewed something that my team wrote, and they were always explaining before the so what, and I had to keep switching the order. So I think that's part of the difference in communicating in the scientific world and to non-scientists. The other thing, and this might be helpful to you, Adrienne, what I learned is you don't have to answer the question that's asked, and that's something I'm still learning, especially in the policy world and even in the media world. As a scientist, like if I get asked a question, I want to answer the question. But what I am learning to do is what they call pivot, which is, what your message is, and so you stick to your message, even if it doesn't exactly answer the question, because at the end of the day, that is what you want to get across. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing in the scientific world, but definitely communicating to non-scientists, that might be the one strategy.
Thank you.
It's an infuriating part of politics. Okay, so that was very helpful, and I think the science communication is such an integral part of so much of oceanography. But before we move into kind of the career advice, I also want to ask a little bit more about what maybe data analysis or working with data skills that you picked up along the way are useful in your career now. So is there another way of asking that is what was helpful in preparing you for the career you're in now, but with an eye towards the data? And let's see, should we start with Adrienne?
Sure.
Ready?
I might pivot. I learned a new term, but I think it'll actually, I think really what's better is what I wish I had done, because I have to outsource. I did a lot with mapping, and I was using ancient seashell scripts and doing, some data analysis that way, but I did not get into enough computer programming. I didn't work directly as much with MATLAB and as much with other things that I know, or Python, or all these things that I knew how to manipulate old ancient Fortran scripts, but I didn't learn a lot of that. So I have to outsource a lot of my data analysis right now. Luckily, I have a partner who can do the program, who does the Python and works with me and my students. And so I know how it's working and what it's doing, but I don't do it myself. And so I would say, honestly, and I heard this from Kenia too, like learning the coding and the programming and how to manipulate, because you have a tremendous amount of data, but if you can't visualize it, if you can't find a way to make coherent figures and coherent sense out of it, it's very hard to communicate that piece. So I would really encourage, and we do with our students, is GIS and as many programming languages, and working with scientific Python, getting opportunities to manipulate and visualize that data, and MATLAB, being able to do it yourself or surrounding yourself with a good team that can help you with those pieces. I definitely think that would have helped me later on if I had done more of the computer languages.
Yeah, here. I'm going to jump in and say I could have used that too. And for me, statistics was what I lacked. I wish I had had more statistics. Kenia and Winnie, either one of you want to jump in?
I can. I didn't realize it at the time, but when I switched and was so as part of oceanography, we did learn some MATLAB, and that was just kind of part of it. And I'd already known some Fortran and Pascal before that, because I'd always had an interest, and that came from being in a bio-optics lab. You had to have that to process that type of data at the time. When I went into systems biology is when I started learning R, and I am ever so thankful now for that, because now I have 20 years of experience in that programming language, and it has served me extremely well for what I do. Also, the systems analysis and kind of some of the things and the bells and whistles that came along with that, the ability to bring in disparate types of data, to have an understanding of how you stack them against each other, and use them, and then obviously some of the statistics. I've never taken a statistics course, which is ever so funny to me, because sometimes I'll get brought in as an expert in statistics, which is crazy, but I did learn how to learn it. And I think that's probably the biggest thing with a lot of that, is that what you learn to do is to learn, and to learn fast sometimes. And so now I do tons of data stuff. Myself and a colleague, we run our data analytics for the company. And I don't know how to manage data. I'm not very good in SQL, but I know how to manage someone who's doing the work. And so that gets back to your team. Like you were saying, Adrienne, you don't usually know all the pieces of the pie across a data science pipeline, but that's why you have different skills. And I guess the last bit that I have really enjoyed over probably the last 10 years now has been the ability to generate web applications and what they do for your communication, because a lot of it is everybody's looking, it's like that elephant, you're all looking at the data set, but you're on different sides of it because you might have handled it different, treated it different, whatever. And web applications, especially things like, whether it's Dash and Python or Shiny, we use a lot of our Shiny. It gives us like an equalizing starting place for multiple parties to engage in the data and to communicate on the fly even with the data through the interactivity. And those have been powerful. So in terms of data tools and what I see people really having and needing, it's skills around the coding, around those communications, around the visuals, has been really big.
Great, thank you. Winnie, do you have some data skill stories?
I just want to support what both Adrienne and Kenia said, and you as well. I did not go down the coding and MATLAB route, and I think I wish I had, and I also am okay with not having done it because, as you have all said, I work with a team of really great colleagues, like a professor at Oxford. He is a genius at MATLAB. He built a launchable application using MATLAB on the desktop. And then another colleague, he is a whiz at R. So I think learn what you can, and then what you don't know, just find the good people, the right people to work with you. And that's okay, because there's so much to learn and it's not possible to know it all.
If I can jump on that, that made me think of something. In the sense that I think the most important piece, because in oceanography and in earth sciences in general, we do so much interpretation and interpolation and modeling, just know enough so that you understand what's happening to that data, because there are so many steps from the raw data, many assumptions that can be made. I worked with seismic data. We had to make so many assumptions before we could get our final images. And if I did it one way, someone else could do it completely different, and it gave you a different answer. So if you understand the statistics, like you're saying, we can understand the statistics, you understand what type of interpolation is happening. You don't necessarily have to do it yourself, but in order to make sure, for quality control and for communicating about it, you have to know what's happening to the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good advice. So I'm going to pause from the moderator questions because I see we have some in the chat now, and some of these are really dovetail nicely with where this conversation is going. So Skylar asks, how essential was your PhD experience to breaking into policy and industry? Would you recommend doing a PhD for someone who wants to move from data science software into a role in climate adaptation or prevention? And I'll just leave that open.
I'll take that. I would say you don't have to have a PhD to work on policy, whether it be in the climate space or biodiversity or other space. Having a PhD helps, but I know many colleagues who don't have one, and they're also effective. It changes the approach and the perspective you bring into a team. So some people are much more advocacy or policy focused. We have lawyers and they bring that angle. As a scientist, I bring the science angle. And actually it's the report that Michaela mentioned earlier. It was actually bringing in people with lots of different perspectives and skill sets together that allowed us to do the amazing work that was done. And so I think you should pursue a PhD if that is what you want to do. It's not an end goal to getting you into climate adaptation and prevention and policy. But you can bring that perspective into that field, once you're finished with your PhD, into that space. But there are other ways to get there.
Great. Kenia, since you're in an industry too, do you have thoughts on the PhD question?
Well, I'm in my position, we're subject to policy as opposed to obviously generating it. We do provide commentary on it. For most in the realm of environmental consulting, really the PhD kind of, I agree with what Winnie said. I mean, if it's something that you want to do, then by all means, go for it. It usually comes in to the extent when you try to take roles that are designated expert. And by expert, I mean in a court of law. it's definitely a helpful credential. Also, when you want to provide commentary, so if a draft policy comes out and you want to speak as an expert or domain expert on that to provide commentary back on that policy, proposed policy, or commentary back to EPA, then those credentials kind of lend some weight. We can argue whether that's fair or not, because I don't think that just having PhD after your name makes you the expert truly, but it does carry at least that perception of a little bit more expertise.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Adrienne, I know you're a college professor, and so that's kind of a requirement, I would say, most of the time for a college professor. Winnie, did you have something you were about to?
Yeah, I just want to follow on to what Kenia said, which is, if you know you want to get into the policy space or more applied science, then the PhD program you get into and what you choose to study could be a bigger determining factor too, in terms of how effective you could be. But you don't have to be. I was trained in basic biological oceanography, but I work on plastics and I had no experience in plastics. So it's like, also in your PhD work, you learn how to learn and learn fast, as Kenia has said before.
Adrienne, did you have something you wanted to add, or no? Okay. There's another one. Sorry, there's a question in here about tools for keeping your science open and reproducible, and also collaborating with others using cloud computing. I think that one we can go ahead and just drop links in there. I have some suggestions as well. Panelists and audience, if you have suggestions for that one. I want to keep us a little bit focused on the career. Somebody asked, Sonia asked, do y'all feel that a PhD in this or wildlife coastal management related fields is likely to pigeonhole someone into an academic position? So it sounds like we've a little bit answered this question. Sonia goes on to say, with a PhD, do you think spending at least some time in academia is a necessity in order to be able to eventually transfer into a more field-related research position? So I don't know if anybody wants to add anything more to the question of the value of a PhD, or if it pigeonholes you or requires you to be in academia.
I'm going to say no, just because I'm sitting here and I'm not a private employee. We're self-owned company. And I work with tons of people who do have PhDs, whether they're in consulting firms. I interface a lot with scientists and industry. So chemists, for Dow, they're super smart. They do really interesting work. Same thing with the scientists we worked across from, even on BP and other companies. So there's a whole world. And I guess I would say from a career perspective, I guess what was one of the things that I did not get a perspective on that I wish I might have had earlier, like in grad school, was this world of applied science that exists outside of a university. I went into grad school wanting to become a professor. And then what I've learned about myself since then is that I really enjoy the very concrete problems, and I like a lot of diversity. So for me, I'm almost like ADD as a scientist. I'm very curious about a lot of things. And so I have, 8 to 10 projects going on at the same time, but I might just be data science support on a groundwater remediation project. I don't know anything about groundwater, but I provide the data science, and then I can go work in my domain knowledge, in a contaminated sediment site. And I really enjoy kind of the diversity and getting to throw my mind into different types of sites and environmental settings. And I wish I'd known more about that and just kind of that applied direct science. But I don't know that it requires a PhD. And I know of plenty of field positions, even with like USGS and folks like that, and they don't require PhDs for that.
I can speak a little bit to the second part of the question about, do you think you have to spend time in academia? And I think it really depends on how possibly doing a postdoc after your research, especially if you want to go into a field-related research position, doing a postdoc position where you still are part of a larger lab and have that guidance and can work up, that might be a very good piece. But there's no reason where you would have to spend time in the actual teaching position or that sort of thing in academia if the goal is a field-related position. So that's I did a PhD specifically because I wanted to become a college professor. I knew that, and in some places it's to the chagrin of my PhD advisors who wanted me to be, their replacement scientist, but that wasn't the path I was going into. But I don't think you have to stay in academia. The PhD can be a means to an end, and it does certainly apply whether or not we deserve that expert label. It certainly lends those credentials, and it is one path, but there are many. And I often encourage my students who are coming out of undergrad to go for a master's, because there are positions and there are more things in science communication and policy, or the master's often might be, it still lends you the credentials and gives you more experience, but it's not the time commitment and that path of being a PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're slowly running out of time, but I did want to get to asking about if you have any recommendations about how to get the jobs you're in now, given your background. So what helped you prepare, let's say, in terms of the actual interviewing or applying? Or do you have any advice for, we're coming from oceanography backgrounds, but you all have ended up in very different fields and very different sectors. So what kind of helped you prepare to apply for the job you're in right now? What advice do you have if somebody wants to get a job like yours?
It's a tough question, and that don't be discouraged, all of you on the call, that we can't just jump in and answer, because there are so many ways to get to, at least in the sector I'm in. And part of it is, first and foremost, the interest, right? And if you're interested, then you will go and talk to different people. So if you're in a more basic science PhD program, go to the conferences where there's more diversity in the type of people who go and the sectors who go, because there are some interdisciplinary conferences out there, like the AAAS annual meeting. I think it's like that. And then there are more and more programs out there, and a couple were noted in the chat, that bring scientists into government. California has one, actually, and I think I want to say Idaho, but I could be misremembering the state. And then more and more states are doing that. And many nonprofit organizations also have positions that are specifically scientist positions, like expert scientist positions. So there are many ways. So the one common thread I would say is talk to people, reach out to people, ask them for informational interviews, ask them what they do, so you actually know what you might be getting yourself into. And the more people you meet, and then you let them know, I want to work in this field, keep me posted on anything you hear. And that's how you do it. You just kind of meet lots of people, build your network, and then spread the word that you're interested.
Yeah, good advice.
I agree with what Winnie said. Well, already this format, that ADSA's put on is a great, just the fact that you're here and listening. I definitely want to emphasize what Winnie said about informational interviews. I get asked for them a lot, and I am always happy to take time to do that. And I think you'll be surprised how many people will, even if you find somebody interesting on LinkedIn, for example, you can cold call somebody, and just reach out and ask that question. And then, yes, looking around and at conferences, hit sessions that aren't in your subject area. That's how I end up just kind of, if nothing else, the cross pollination on an analysis path. It could be something quantitative, or it could be something about the science, can be really interesting. So I often try to go to sessions that are nothing to do, a session on seabirds. What do I know about seabirds? but it is really fascinating to see how they approach their data, what they think about, what the considerations are, and then you get to meet new people. So those are my kind of first two big things.
I would just add on to that, being part of the professional societies in your field. So American Geophysical Union, AGU has a huge section, Ocean Sciences, and the diverse ones as well, making sure if you are currently a student in any kind, being part of all of the career panels. There's so many things out there that are geared towards students, and making sure that even not just the professional societies, but being aware of the newsletters and these groups that are out there that you may not have heard of, so that you see what kind of jobs are there. For academic jobs, I was very fortunate that I could take place in the Carleton College had a preparing for academic careers in the geosciences workshops, and this was NSF funded, so I was able to get flown from Hawaii to Oklahoma to do a workshop that basically said, what is it like to teach at an R1 versus a primarily undergraduate institution, things that I didn't really know, even though I had an idea of what I wanted to do. How do you write a teaching statement? So these workshops are out there, so if you're thinking about going into academia, there are a lot of resources. I'll throw up that website into the chat as well. So try to find those opportunities, because they are, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. There's a lot of amazing opportunities out there. Put yourself out there, communicate with as many people as possible. I just wrote down informational interviews, so now I can share that with my students as an option, something I hadn't thought about. So I appreciate learning that as well.
And Winnie just dropped in the chat, alumni networks too. That's another great resource, right? So I apologize. I have to drop off because I'm now a minute late for another meeting. Stella will take over. Panelists, if you have a moment to stay for one more question. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Stella's going to ask you about things that you wish you would have done differently. It's a tough one, and I'm going to look forward to seeing your responses. It was wonderful to see all of you, and thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the question that we typically like to finish off with is, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would do differently? If you could go back, would you take more courses in a certain area, or would you maybe master it out? That was actually a discussion topic in one of our last panels. So yeah, maybe just something that you can just share with the audience here about some insights that you've gained over your career.
I'll start. One of the things I have thought about, and I'm not sure that I would necessarily choose this course, is I might have chosen to study a more applied topic. That said, and I've shared this with all of you on this call, like, if you want to work in a certain field, then you will likely get there eventually. So, for example, when I was in Maldives, in the Sri Lanka Maldives mission for the U.S. Agency for International Development, my colleague whose position I took over, she was an engineer and what is that, planner. That was her field. And I had thought about maybe becoming an engineer in undergrad, but then I just loved the ocean, and so I went that way. But I ended up being in the same place as her, and now I'm in the same place as colleagues with many different backgrounds. So I think it's about pursuing what you want to pursue, regardless of what you study. And I say I wish I had studied something different is because some of the scientists I work with now, like, we work with them. They help us convince policymakers to do certain things. And they're still in academia. So you can also still affect change from an academic institution. So it's more about what do you want to have impact on, and then finding the people and the outlets that will allow you to do that. You're not constrained just because you're in academia and not be able to impact policy and other aspects of society. So And then the other thing I would say for me is emphasis for me would be learning how to communicate better sooner and emphasizing more about collaboration and developing partnerships. I think I would have wanted to have focused some more on that while I was in grad school.
Thanks. Kenia, Adrienne, do you have anything to add?
I think just being open. I appreciate, like Adrienne said, she knew she always wanted to go back to that undergrad, so that's really good, and you can channel it there. And so I guess if I wish I'd known something, it would have been to the extent that, I always knew I wanted to be a scientist, but on the applied side, if I had known a bit more about it, I might have spent my PhD years on a different set of compounds that would have had an application. Literally, I would have been the same PhD, just a completely different chemical class. And that would have kind of leveraged to that more applied, because at the time I always knew that I wanted to look at effects on biology. And I didn't know if I wanted to do that as a research professor or with a soft money research position or in where I'm at now. And I think that's just something that there was no way for me to know ahead of time until you kind of get going. And that was more about me learning about myself and kind of where's your scientific happy place, essentially. But I do wish I had known more on the applied side, and it might have shifted some of the research focus. But I wouldn't change the grad school. I wouldn't change the 2 postdocs, simply because I really learned a lot of different skills in those 2 that has heavily shaped what I do now.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a particularly good answer. I think in some ways my PhD research was so focused, so research focused, and since that was not where I ended up, or where I think I even knew I'd ended up, I might have done a different path that had a more of an education focus at the time. It was interesting to start as a college professor knowing that I had never taken a single education course in my life. And suddenly the PhD qualifies you to teach. And I know we have all had professors that speak to that is not entirely true. So learning to be a good educator was something that I sort of added on through substitute teaching in elementary schools and working and doing as much tutoring and other things, because I knew that was the piece. But I think I would have added a little bit more. I did as much teaching assistantships, things as like my advisors would allow me in grad school. But I think that I could have done it differently. And yet, kind of what was Kenia saying is, I don't know that I would change it, because I learned some really good skills and I took wonderful classes and learned skills as a researcher that I can pass along, and working with collaborations and trying to really, as Winnie said too, really learning how to collaborate with other scientists and pulling in all those strengths was something grad school did help me with. So I don't know that I would do it differently, but I look at it sometimes and think it could have been easier than the path I took. But I think in the end, it got me where I needed to be. So I'm going to just say it was the right path. There are so many different ways, and we've all come from these different paths. And I this is going to sound totally hard. Okay, I don't know if you're going to believe me. What I'm going to try to say is, don't panic, because there are so many different paths. And even if that dream job or grad school position or that one didn't come through, that does not mean that you're not going to find your way through another path. And if you know what you want to do and you're working toward it and you're here already making that effort, there's so many ways to get there that I truly believe you will get there, and to try not to be disheartened. And I think the most important thing right now, and I think can see from myself and the panelists, we all love what we do and we came at it differently, but that's the biggest thing, is find something you love and do that, and you will get there.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists, for your amazing advice. And thank you, audience, for tuning in today.